Welcome back, focused learners, to another explainer. Today, we are setting the stage for a completely objective, slide-driven mapping of a seriously controversial piece of media. We're going to break down the claims made in a wide-ranging, unedited interview between London Real host Brian Rose and Dr. Judy Mikovits. Now, because this interview dives into some incredibly explosive allegations regarding global health, vaccines, and the origins of COVID-19, I want to be super clear. Our goal today isn't to validate or debunk. Rather, it's to impartially unpack the exact structure of the arguments they're presenting. We're essentially using our slides to visually map out these massive claims, just so you can fully understand the architecture of this alternative narrative. Okay, let's dive into this. Here is the structural roadmap we'll be using to compartmentalize these wide-ranging allegations into digestible themes. We'll start with the context of the interview, move into allegations of historical corruption, then COVID-19 origin claims, suppressed treatments and cures, and finally, scientism and the conclusion.
All right, Section 1, Context of the Interview, Replatforming and the Plandemic Narrative.
So to really get this, you have to understand that the very foundation of this interview is built around mutual claims of censorship. The host, Brian Rose, points out that London Real had been completely in the dark for 25 months. And this really sets a crucial tone for the entire explainer. You see, both the interviewer and the interviewee frame themselves as embattled truth-tellers. They truly feel they are fighting against an algorithm and a broader system that urgently wants to keep their message quiet.
And that brings us to the guest, Dr. Judy Mikovits. The source material presents her as a molecular biologist and medical researcher with 40 decades of experience. She's the best-selling author of Plague of Corruption and, as you might know, the central figure in that viral Plandemic documentary series. Throughout the interview, she frames her entire career as this 40-year mission to expose systemic fraud at the absolute highest levels of healthcare, specifically calling out government agencies and officials. Moving on to Section 2, Allegations of Historical Corruption, from the 1980s to the present. To understand her current claims, the interview insists we actually have to look decades into the past. Mikovits constructs this sprawling historical narrative. For instance, she claims that back in the early 1980s, she was part of a team that isolated HIV, and says she was pressured by Dr. Anthony Fauci to hand over confidential data to be turned into a bioweapon. Yeah, a bioweapon. She also alleges that in 1983, Fauci forced experimental hepatitis B vaccines on vulnerable populations, which she claims actively transmitted a synthetic HIV. Skipping ahead, she asserts that by 2005, a SARS virus was essentially injected into standard polio vaccines. She even states that in 2011, she was literally kidnapped by bad actors in police uniforms to silence her research. And all of this eventually leads to her 2019 meeting with filmmaker Mikki Willis, which birthed the Plandemic films. The gravity of her historical allegations really culminates in statements like this one. She says she never believed the corruption would extend to the, and I'm quoting here, premeditated murder of hundreds of thousands of Americans. Look, we are keeping a strict journalistic distance here, but it is absolutely vital to read this exact quote to understand the sheer starkness and scale of the allegations she is leveling against public health officials. All right, Section 3, COVID-19 Origin Claims, Rejecting the Mainstream Narratives. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the stark contrast it sets up. During the interview, Brian Rose explicitly asks if the virus was leaked from a lab in Wuhan, but Mikovits outright rejects even this popular alternative theory. Instead, she asserts that it was actually a military operation shipped directly from the U.S. Army installation at Fort Detrick. So let's walk clearly through the step-by-step process of how she claims the virus was disseminated. According to her narrative, the pathogen was manufactured at Fort Detrick's Biosafety Level 4 facility. From there, she alleges it was shipped globally in small vials to locations like Wuhan and Italy. Next, it was amplified in large fermenters using a specific monkey kidney cell line called Vero E6. And finally, and this is a huge cornerstone of her claim, she says it was intentionally injected into the global population through standard routine polio and flu shots. Because of this alleged timeline, Mikovits fundamentally redefines the term COVID itself. In this interview, she insists COVID is not a traditional airborne infectious disease at all. Instead, she defines it as a covert operation, and basically just a collection of inflammatory diseases and injuries that resulted directly from those injected vaccines. She emphatically states that the illness did not travel through the air. Which brings us to Section 4, Suppressed Treatments and Cures, Healing at Essentially No Cost. According to the source material, there was this vast arsenal of safe therapeutics ready to be deployed. She lists off specific alternative treatments like ivermectin, Suramin, which she identifies as a purinergic modulator, the asthma medication budesonide, peptide T, hyperbaric oxygen therapy, and even cannabis. She asserts that the medical establishment actively suppressed these simple treatments, basically arguing that acknowledging them would ruin the agenda to roll out a global vaccine. And to really hammer home her point about accessibility, Mikovits claims that the entirety of these botanical and nutritional treatments could heal patients for less than $200 a month. The host, Brian Rose, neatly summarizes this whole segment with this quote, drawing a direct, unbroken line between the alleged suppression of cheap, simple drugs, the resulting loss of life, and the financial motives driving the subsequent massive vaccine rollout. Let's move to our final section, scientism and the conclusion, the dead man's trigger and final warnings. And this brilliantly illustrates the philosophical core of their argument. Both Rose and Mikovits make a huge distinction between pure, objective science and what they call scientism. They define scientism as a dangerous cult that demands blind, absolute obedience under the guise of scientific authority. They argue that the public wasn't blinded by actual science, but indoctrinated by this cult of compliance. Now, to protect herself against this system, Mikovits introduces this concept of a dead man's trigger. She explains that the final chapter of her book, Plague of Corruption, acts as her ultimate insurance policy. She claims it contains all the suppressed data, cell lines, and evidence, which is set to be automatically released to the world if bad actors ever attempt to permanently silence her. So what's her overarching call to action? Rooted in her uncompromising stance against all forms of injection, she states, "Nothing that you inject will ever give immunity according to God." She advocates entirely for natural immunity, urging her audience to completely reject the pharmaceutical paradigm. Which leaves us with a pretty critical thought to ponder. We've just mapped out a highly structured, fiercely alternative narrative that fundamentally tries to rewrite modern medical history. In an era where alternative media platforms can widely broadcast these sprawling allegations to millions of people, how do we, as consumers, effectively navigate the line between healthy critical skepticism and objective medical reality? It's a huge question of media literacy that really demands our attention. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, focused learners. Keep asking questions, and I'll see you next time.